the majority of Muslims don't believe in the concept of evolution. So if you see in red is the percentage of people that believe in evolution, you can see that in most Muslim countries, that a majority of people don't believe in the concept of evolution. Now, going back to what Richard Dawkins says, if the majority, if you don't believe in evolution, then you're stupid, crazy, or insane. Linking the two things together, by extension, this would be sort of an indictment of the Muslim population, saying that because they don't believe in evolution, that they're filled with stupid, crazy, and insane people. And this is the type of rhetoric, although he's an academic person, it's this type of rhetoric that eventually leads to the rise of someone like Donald Trump or Ted Cruz. It justifies this type of thinking. So the second reason to talk about the concept of evolution is because, as I mentioned, some people will use this as a justification to criticize Muslims and to justify various policies that are against Muslims. The second reason. The third reason to talk about the topic of evolution is within this environment where you have a lot of ignorance or a lot of things that people talk about in ignorance. What you have is you have people that bring forth topics or concepts that aren't necessarily Islamic, but they say that they're Islamic. And specifically, I'm talking about this man here, Harun Yahya. Harun Yahya is one of the leading, I would say, lecturers in the Muslim world. And his real topic of focus is the concept of evolution. So he tries to talk about evolution from what he believes to be an Islamic perspective. The problem, however, with Harun Yahya is what he often takes is he takes creationist ideas and he brands them as being Muslim ideas. So he spreads ideas that aren't necessarily Islamic ideas. What he takes is he takes mainstream creationist ideas and tries to package them into Muslim ideas. So he's not really showing what I would say the most comprehensive thinking of what Islam says. So what I hope here to do tonight is I hope to answer this question: what does Islam say about evolution? And I'm putting Islam here between parentheses because, as all of you know, there are many schools of thought and many different opinions. But what I'm trying to summarize here today is essentially what I would think is probably the most as a point of view that isn't often discussed, but it was always in the mainstream up until recently. So what we'll try to do is answer this question: what does Islam say about evolution? And we'll divide today's talk into 5 parts. First, I wanted to talk about Islam and the scientific enterprise, because evolution, when you look at it, it's one extension of science. So to understand what Islam says about evolution, first and foremost, you have to understand what Islam says about science. If you understand what Islam says about science, then you'll get a more accurate understanding of what Islam says about evolution. Evolution is only one extension or the product of the scientific enterprise. So what you need to more fundamentally ask yourself is, what does Islam say about science? And then take it from there. So that's what we'll start off with in the first part. And the second part, I wanted to define some key terms. So when people oftentimes talk about evolution, they'll have certain ideas in their heads. But we need to really be precise when we're talking about evolution, and I'll try to define some terms. In the third part, I'll talk about creationism, Darwinism, and the history of evolution within Islam. I'll try to look at it from a philosophical and historical perspective. What did previous Muslim scholars say about evolution? And to understand where the modern Muslim thought is. And then probably the most important reason that people discuss evolution, they want to understand evolution as it relates to humans. So in biology, oftentimes you study evolution as it relates to insects or to viruses or to bacteria. But that's all fine and well. But the reason that people are interested in evolution, because they want to understand how it relates to human origin and to the arising of humans. And then finally, some final thoughts, and we'll open it up to questions and answers. So we'll start off with this first part, Islam and the scientific enterprise. And what I want to say here is that the Quran, the Muslim holy book, is, as all of you know, composed of 114 chapters or 114 surahs. Of these surahs, the Quran as a whole is not a science book. Meaning what? Meaning oftentimes people look to the Quran to prove scientific points. But that's not the point of the Quran. The Quran was revealed to really elevate humanity to its optimal potential. Now, having said that, the Quran does contain scientific observations that are meant to allow people to think about the creation and the glory of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you look at the Quran and you try to break it down, the Quran has about 250 ayahs altogether that talk about legislative or fiqhi issues, meaning things like how to perform the ablution, how to perform wudu, how to perform the fast, how to perform the pilgrimage. Altogether, if you were to count up all of those surahs or all of those verses, they add up to 250 verses. By contrast, there are 750 verses related to nature and natural phenomena. In fact, if you look at the names of the various chapters of the Quran, they're named after things like natural creations, like the chapter of the cow, the chapter of the honeybee, the chapter of the ant. There is a reason behind this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala names these chapters in order to trigger mankind to think about the creation. In fact, this is one of the verses that is often, that I think is really representative of some of the verses in the Quran. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَ رَتْقًا فَفَتَحْنَاهُمَا وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. Here Allah is saying, have not the non-believers seen that we created the earth and the heavens? They were joined together as one unit before we clothed them asunder. So this gets back to the point that the Quran is not a science book, but oftentimes it contains observations that can be related to modern day phenomenon. And this verse, for example, people would say it talks about the concept of the Big Bang Theory, meaning that everything was created from a single origin. But here when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَانَتَ رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا, they were as one unit joined together before we split them apart. This is an allusion to the concept of the Big Bang Theory. The point being that the Quran encourages critical thinking. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeatedly says, don't believe something just simply because your parents believed it, or don't believe something because your forefathers and ancestors believed it. Rather, everything that you believe, think about it and think, why am I believing this thing? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in fact makes this a commandment. In Surah Isra, chapter 17, ayah 36, says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Do not believe something without that with which you have no knowledge. وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. Don't follow something that you're ignorant of. إِنَّ السَّمْعَ, meaning your hearing, وَالْبَصَرَ, meaning your vision, وَالْفُؤَادَ, meaning your heart. كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. You will be responsible for these things. The point being, the Quran encourages critical thinking from the very beginning. Don't take anything for granted. And why am I saying all of this? Because in fact, it's this type of thinking that led to the creation of modern day science. The New York Times in 1999, remember 1999 was the end of the millennium, and it was the beginning of the year 2000. So what the New York Times did in 1999 is they brought together a group of scholars and they asked them, what was the most important idea of the last 1,000 years? So they asked a group of academics and a group of scientists and politicians and many people from different areas of life. What is the most important idea in the last 1,000 years, meaning from the year 1000 to the year 2000? And secondly, who is the most important person that came up with this idea? And what those scholars came up with is that the most important idea of the last 1,000 years was the idea of this man, Ibn al-Haytham, or al-Hazm. Now, who is Ibn al-Haytham? And in fact, this is the quote from the New York Times. The most important idea of this millennium was set in motion by a man named Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. Now, as you can see, this was Abu Ali was a follower of Ahlul Bayt. He was a well-known student of the school of Ahlul Bayt of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. The reason that the New York Times and this group of scholars picked Ibn Haytham is because he came up with the concept of the modern-day scientific method. Meaning what? Meaning all of you study science in high school and in middle school and university, but oftentimes they don't actually tell you how the scientific enterprise developed. But if you look at what Ibn Haytham did, he was the first person to take an observation and try to break it down into the 7 parts of what we call the scientific observation. Meaning, he takes an observation, he states a problem, he formulates a hypothesis, he tries to come up with a question to answer the observation, and then he tests the hypothesis, and then he analyzes the experimental results, and then he interprets the data, and then he publishes the findings. This is what science is about. Science is taking an observation, testing it, and then publishing about it. The man who came up with this was Ibn Haytham. In fact, my office in Cambridge is right next to MIT. At MIT, they have this big wall of important scientists that they think contributed to the history of science. The man at the center of the wall is Ibn Haytham, right in the center. Really a beautiful picture. They have Ibn Haytham, and the second man that they have is Jabir ibn Hayyan, or Geber, the father of modern-day chemistry. The reason that I'm bringing up all of these points is that the scientific enterprise and Islam have always been co-linked together. And this is something which is different from the history of science with the Christian church or with the Catholic church. As all of you know, you have an individual like Galileo who was excommunicated or kicked out of the church because he believed that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the earth. At the time, this was fundamentally considered to be a radical idea, so he was kicked out of the Catholic Church. By contrast, in Islam, we don't have any types of these types of events where a scientist gets kicked out of the religion simply for having a scientific observation or a scientific fact. So the reason that I'm making up, that I'm describing all of these things is because science and religion have always been co-linked in Islam. The most religious individuals in Islamic history have always been the most prominent scientists. You have people like Ibn Haytham, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and the second individual that I wanted to talk about is this man, Ibn Tufayl. And he has really an important book in the history of science called Hayy ibn Yaqdan by Ibn Tufayl. The reason that I talk about this book is because here Ibn Tufayl also talks about the scientific enterprise. And this book was really important for the development of the European Enlightenment. In fact, it affected many people like Newton, Kant, Rousseau, Voltaire, and all of these other individuals. The point being that when we look at science and Islam, these things have always been co-linked together. There's no separation between empirical observations and between belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Simply because you're a believer doesn't mean that you can't be a good scientist, and vice versa. Because you're a good scientist doesn't mean you have to be a non-believer like Richard Dawkins. Now I wanted to transition into the concept of evolution. And I wanted to specifically talk about different terms and what we mean when we talk about evolution. So one of the things that I wanted to get across is that this picture right here, which many of you have seen, when we talk about evolution, this is not what we mean by evolution. This is the popular image of evolution. But when you talk to scientists, this is not what they mean when they talk about evolution. They don't mean that mankind came from a monkey over many years. Rather, when scientists talk about biological evolution, they mean this picture right here. That everything started off from a single origin, maybe about 13 million years ago with regard to humans. And then over time, you have the separation and the sort of budding into different trees. So that mankind maybe came, that all of creation came from a single origin, but then over time you have different branches. And this is really what's meant by evolution. And with regard to evolution, there's really 3 key terms that we mean here. So biological evolution means descent with modification, meaning over time, the features of an individual species will change. When we talk about microevolution is the change in the genes that you have. So for example, your eye color is determined by the genes in your cells. Whether you become diabetic or not is in part dependent on genes. Whether you have high cholesterol is in part dependent on the genes that you have. So the changes in the genes is called microevolution. So over time, what you'll have is you'll have mutations and you'll have different types of chromosomal events, and these cause changes over time in the small scale. Macroevolution is the concept that there's changes on a bigger scale, meaning that you have species and creations that change in terms of their shape and appearance. And the important point here is that all living things are subject to a product of variation and selection. And when we talk about selection, there are many different types of selection. We have, for example, natural selection, which is probably the most important idea that Darwin came up with. Actually, it wasn't Darwin, we'll get into that later on. But then you have different types of selection. So individual selection, group selection, species selection. And what this concept essentially means is that you have a limited set of resources. So animals only have a little food or a little water. And the way that they compete or survive against each other is that the species that can make the most efficient use of the food or of the resources will be the one that will naturally emerge, that will naturally be selected from the environment. So these are some of the common terms that we talk about when we describe evolution. So what I wanted you to take away here is that evolution is not simply mankind coming up as from a monkey, but rather evolution involves multiple complicated scientific concepts, and there are many elements that are involved here when we talk about evolution. Now, in the third part, what I wanted to do here is I wanted to talk about some of the common rejections. Why do people reject evolution? And what does Islam say about some of these rejections of evolution? The first reason that many people oftentimes reject evolution is they say that Earth is only thousands of years old. So, for example, if you read the Bible literally, you'll come up with the conclusion that Earth is only 5,000 or 6,000 years old. This is the first reason that people oftentimes reject evolution. And if Earth is thousands of years old, well, how can species have evolved over millions of years or billions of years? So what does Islam say about this? How old is the earth according to Islam? Well, according to the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a fundamental point that time is relative and that there really is no clearly defined concept of the earth being thousands of years old. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَيَسْتَعْجِلُونَكَ بِالْعَذَابِ وَلَنْ يُخْلِفَ اللَّهُ وَعْدَهُ وَإِنَّ يَوْمًا عِنْدَ رَبِّكَ كَأَلْفِ سَنَةٍ مِمَّا تُعِدُّونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, and indeed, a day with your Lord is like 1,000 years of which you count. Here the concept being that time is a relative concept. And a day for us is maybe like 1,000 years or 1,000 years in the eyes of in our perspective is like a day in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that time is relative. And when we measure the age of the earth, we can't measure it in terms of what we know to be the age of the earth. But ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or God, has the ultimate sort of measurement of the age of the earth. So when we get to this concept of the earth being thousands of years old, the Islamic perspective is we don't really know how old the earth is because time is relative. And only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ultimately know the age of the earth. But what we think is that based on empirical observations, the universe is billions of years old. But before that, no one really knows. Ultimately, that knowledge is only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, the second thing that people oftentimes, or the reason that people criticize evolution, is this concept of organisms are not derived from a common ancestor. So here you're seeing this map here. You're seeing that everything comes from a common organism. With regard to humans, maybe a common organism about 13 million years old. Oftentimes what people criticize with regard to evolution is that everything was created uniquely or specifically by itself, that there was no common origin. So what does Islam say about this idea? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very clear In chapter 24, verse 45, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly states that all life derives from a common source. Allah says, وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَ كُلَّ دَابَّةٍ مِّن مَاءٍ. And Allah has created every animal from water, meaning every animal has at its origin a common source. And so there is the possibility that every organism came from a unified source, because ultimately all creation goes back to Allah or to God, and it's all up to God or Allah to really define the mechanism by which He created all of resources. And in fact, going back to this concept, thousands of years ago, this was really a concept that the Muslim scholars elaborated on. There's a famous book called Kitab al-Mahsul by a man named Muhammad al-Naqshbandi, who was a famous scholar in the city of Basra back and he died in the year of 943. And he was a follower of the Ahlul Bayt school of thought, the school of thought of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. And in this book, it's really fascinating that Muhammad al-Naqshbandi says, while man has sprung from sentient creatures like animals, these have sprung from vegetal beings like plants, and these in turn from combined substances, these from elementary qualities, these from celestial bodies, and these from the universal soul. So what Muhammad al-Naqshbandi is saying is this concept that ultimately all of creation goes back to the common source, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's referring to this common source as being the universal soul. So when we get to this criticism that other organisms are not derived from a common ancestor, what the Islamic perspective is, based on the Quran and based on the traditional Islamic philosophical approaches or views of point, is that in fact, all organisms do come from a common source, and that common source is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you look at it on a physical level, all organisms are derived from the physical material, which is water. Without water, you have no life. That's why you'll notice that oftentimes when the various astronauts and these lunar missions go to different planets, what's the first thing that they look for? They look for water. And they know that if they find water, that they'll probably find life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us over 1400 years ago, وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَ كُلَّ دَابَّةٍ مِّن مَاءٍ. And Allah has created every animal from water. So the concept being that all creation comes from a similar physical source, which is essentially related to water, but then spiritually and metaphysically, all creation goes back to the universal soul, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, this is really not a problem with regard to Islam. Now, the third point that people often bring up is that organisms, and I apologize, by the way, the slides aren't showing up properly, but I think, that's fine. If you want these slides later on, we can share it with you, inshallah. So the third point that people often criticize comes to this point of organisms, especially humans, have fixed forms, meaning humans as we know them today have always been this way, meaning the humans that we have, all of you, on average a human is maybe 5 to 6 feet tall, maybe weighs 100 to 200 pounds, maybe has these features. So we always think that humans have always existed this way. However, Islam, and especially the Islamic perspective, tells us that this isn't necessarily the point. In fact, if you go to, for example, Lebanon, if you go to the grave of Nabiullah Sheet, you'll notice that he's maybe like 12 feet tall. If you go to the grave of Ibrahim, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, maybe 12 feet tall. The point being that humans as we know them today maybe didn't exist this way thousands of years ago or millions of years ago. The feature of humans today has evolved over time, and this isn't necessarily the same human that we have today. And this isn't necessarily a new concept. In fact, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, in the tradition of Mufaddal, which by the way I urge all of you to read. This is a beautiful hadith. One of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq's companions was a man named Mufaddal. So he came to the Imam and asked him about the nature of creation. And what was ended up being recorded in the book of Bihar al-Anwar is this tradition of Mufaddal, where Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq talks about the nature of creation and talks about the different organisms And one of the beautiful things in this tradition is where Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq says, all the peculiarities of a bird's creation conform to its environment and its manner of life. Meaning here Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is saying that organisms and creatures adapt to their specific environment. So if you live in a environment that's filled with dry heat or with dry weather, your body will adapt to that specific environment. And if you live in an environment of cold weather, you'll adapt specifically to that environment. That's why you'll notice that people in the Middle East, because of their geography and their environment, look completely different than people who are native to Norway or England or Iceland. This is the nature of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created creation. That creation adapts to its environment, and that things don't have fixed forms, but rather they adapt and change according to their environment. And in fact, this idea, one of the students or one of the followers of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq was a man who came onto the scene many years later. He was also a follower of the school of Ahlul Bayt. He lived in the city of Basra, and he was of African origin. His name is Al-Jahiz. Al-Jahiz was a follower of the school of Ahlul Bayt, and he has a beautiful book called Kitab al-Hayawan. And in this book, what he talks about is he talks about mechanisms of evolution. My point being that oftentimes people think that Darwin was the first person to come up with this concept of evolution. But if you look at it, this concept of life or of natural selection actually came up many thousands of years before Darwin and wasn't necessarily a new idea. And this book particularly, Al-Jahiz, is really interesting because in the book of Kitab al-Hayawan, and this is Al-Jahiz, by the way, you can see his African features. He lived from the year 781 to 869. In this book, he talks about the mechanisms of evolution. And he talks about some of the concepts that Darwin would refer to many years later on. He talks about, for example, the struggle of existence. He talks about, for example, the transformation of species or how animals change over time. And he talks about, for example, the contribution of environmental factors to the changing of the physical form. And, there's a great book by a British historian named Rebecca Stott called Darwin's Ghosts, The Secret History of Evolution, where she talks about the influence of Al-Jahiz on the ideas of Darwin. And one of the concepts that she talks about is this idea that was in Al-Jahiz's book of Kitab al-Hayawan, where he talks about animals engage in a struggle for existence, for resources, to avoid being eaten and to breed. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics, to ensure survival, thus transforming into new species. Animals that survive to breed can pass on their successful characteristics to offspring. The point being that classical Islamic philosophy and classical Islamic approaches towards science have always been fully on board with this concept of change over time or of adaptation over time. So when we talk about creationism, Darwinism, and the history of evolution within Islam, what you'll notice is that Islam has no problem with some of the fundamental concepts of evolution. With regard to the age of the earth, Islam will tell you that we don't really know how old the earth is, but we know definitively that it can't just be thousands of years old, because as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, 10,000 years for us is like a day in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So time is relative. The second creationist myth is that species remain fixed, meaning a human will always be the same wherever they go, or an animal will always be the same where it goes. But when you look at what the Quran says and what classic Islamic theology and perspectives say, they very clearly say that organisms change over time. And then the third myth of organisms coming from different origins, Islam tells you very clearly that everything is created from water and everything derives from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we come to towards the end of the talk. What does Islam say about humans and evolution? So everything that I've talked about, many people will have no problem with. They'll say, okay, fine. Maybe the birds have changed over time, maybe the insects have changed over time, maybe the butterflies have changed over time. But what about humans? What does Islam say about humans and evolution and the changing form? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah 71, Ayah 14 says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَقَدْ خَلَقَكُمْ أَطْوَارًا. Seeing that it is you who has created you in diverse stages. Now this ayah has been interpreted in different ways. Some of the Mufassirin say that this refers to the different stages of the human within the mother's womb. Meaning what? Meaning when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَدْ خَلَقَكُمْ أَطْوَارًا, He's saying that when you're first conceived, you have the sperm and the egg uniting together in the mother's womb. Then you have the zygote. Then you have the embryo, then you have the fetus, then you have the human. This is what Allah means. This is one interpretation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created you in stages. Another interpretation is that the human form that we have today wasn't the same human form that existed during the time that Adam alayhi salam came on earth. And in fact, this is an idea that Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq and Imam Muhammad al-Baqir talk about very clearly. That the humans that we know of today, like you and I, weren't necessarily the same humans that existed during the time of Prophet Adam alayhi salam. This is a few hadiths from Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq that sort of talks about this idea. In the first hadith, and I want to spend some time on these hadiths, Imam al-Baqir says, God be exalted, since creating the world has created 7 kinds, none of whom were of the race of Adam. Meaning there were 7 types of humans maybe before we have the modern day version of Prophet Adam alayhi salam. He created them from the surface of the earth and set them being one after another with its kind upon the earth. Then he created Adam, the father of mankind, and brought his children into being from him. Meaning before the modern day version of Prophet Adam alayhi salam, according to Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, there were many other forms that we would call, being sort of human-like in their origin, but that wouldn't necessarily be associated with Adam. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam has a very similar type of hadith where he says, perhaps you think God has not created a humanity other than you. No, I swear to God that He has created thousands upon thousands of mankind, and you are the last among them. Meaning, among human existence, there were other creatures that were very similar to humans, but weren't exactly like Prophet Adam alayhi salam. And this is an important point to take. When we talk about human evolution, Adam alayhi salam was completely different from all of creation beforehand. But there were organisms that were very similar in maybe shape and form that looked like Adam, but according to the Islamic viewpoint, weren't the creation of Adam, or Prophet Adam alayhi salam as we know him today. And in fact, in modern times, we notice this very similar Muslims have taken this further. There was recently a conference in England about 3 years ago that I would urge all of you to look. It was a full-day conference, about 8 hours, where they brought different speakers from different schools of thought and different perspectives, including expertise. And the topic of the conference was, have Muslims misunderstood evolution? And the conclusion that I'm going to give you, but you can look this up for yourself. I mean, the conference was a full day. It was about 8 hours. The conclusion is that within the modern understanding of evolution, there's nothing that necessarily negates Islamic belief in evolution. But what Islam negates is this absence of a fundamental mover, or this fundamental difference between Prophet Adam and all of the other creation, which is the difference between the Muslim belief in evolution and, let's say, the atheist belief in evolution like Dawkins and others. And it was really an interesting thing. And I just wanted to close with a few final quotes. There's a beautiful book by some of the scholars of Islam, by Ayatollah Behishti and Ayatollah Bahunab. They have a beautiful book called The Philosophy of Islam. And I would urge all of you to read this book. It really, in very simple terms, deals with some of the modern issues that Muslims are dealing with, particularly, let's say, the youth and the younger people. And Ayatollah Beheshti and Bahana were among the founders of the modern-day country of Iran, but they were both assassinated by the agents of the Shah back in the 1980s. But they were really amazing Islamic figures that were really able to combine the best of traditional Muslim knowledge with and engage, let's say, Western perspectives in terms of belief and thoughts. So Beheshti and Bahana, in their book Philosophy of Islam, say the emergence of man on the basis of evolution from other primates is not in conflict with the teachings of the revealed religions, especially with the belief of an almighty creator of the world. Meaning, the fact that maybe we came from some organism that maybe looks like a monkey isn't necessarily in conflict with Islam. But, incidentally, the principles of evolution are still subject to further scientific investigation, for they are faced with much criticism, especially as they were enunciated by Darwin. Meaning, don't just believe in evolution because your teachers teach you evolution. Rather, going back to this ayah in Surah Isra, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Ask questions. Whenever your teachers bring up something to you, ask them, what's your evidence for this type of observation? What's your evidence that there is no God in terms of the creation of the universe? Because everything that we see in creation points to the existence of a higher power, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what I mean here is I wanted to show you one example of what I mean here when I talk about why we need to question certain aspects of evolution, and what I mean here in terms of questioning. So a few years ago, the common ancestor of mankind was thought to be this fossil called Lucy. How many of you have heard of Lucy? Lucy is supposed to be the common origin of where humans came from. 5 years ago, they found a fossil that was older than Lucy, and that caused all of Darwinian evolution or evolutionary science to have to revise their models of evolution. So up until the time of Lucy, many scientists thought that humans were maybe about 5 million years old. When Lucy came on the scene, when they found this new fossil called Artie, they had to revise everything by 2 million years. They said, oh, by the way, we're actually off by 2 million years. The common ancestor of mankind wasn't Lucy, but it was Artie. But if you had talked to them before they found Artie, you would have found that they would have been absolutely sure in their belief that Lucy was the oldest fossil. But then they came up with this new fossil called Artie, and they said, no, actually, this is the oldest ancestor of humans. And they even had a major paper called Re-Examining Human Origins in Light of Ardipithecus Remedius. So they say that, now that we actually have this fossil, we have to add maybe 2 million years to all of our models. The reason that I bring this up is two reasons. Number one, as you can see, the evidence for the existence or for the common ancestor of humans is still evolving, literally. So maybe in a few weeks they'll find a fossil that's even older, and they'll say that this is the common ancestor of humankind. That's the first reason. The evidence is incomplete, and oftentimes they'll try to deny the existence of Allah with an incomplete set of evidence. So you have to ask them, what's your evidence? Bring me forth your evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't exist. And then engage them on a level of evidence. Show me your evidence. Because oftentimes, when they do bring you their evidence, there's a lot of creative interpretation in how they look at the evidence. And this is the example of Artie. These are the fossils that they found from Artie. And based on these fossils, they said that Artie looks like this organism right here. So they only had maybe 25, 30 bones. And based on these bones, they said, well, this is what Artie looks like. But the question you have to ask yourself is, how did they come up with this picture based on only these 25 or 30 pieces of bone evidence? There's a lot of creative, interpretation here that they don't often tell you about. They'll just say that this is the way that science is, but you have to be critical and ask them, what's your evidence for these things? So I think really, all we can say about evolution in mankind is that humans are unique in terms of all of creation for several reasons, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically gives us two reasons that modern day evolution has not been able to answer. The first thing that modern evolution has not been able to answer is the emergence of the soul. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this over 1400 years ago in Surah 17, Ayah 85. It says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the soul, and say the soul is one of the commands of my Lord, and you are not given aught but very little knowledge of it. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You've only been given very little of this knowledge. The reason that I bring up this ayah is because there are actually two people that came up with the concept of evolution by natural selection. The first person all of you know as Charles Darwin. But there was another man who came up with evolution at the same time as Darwin that many of you probably study in your textbooks. Does anyone know the name of the other man who came up with the concept of evolution at the same time as Darwin? No. Alfred Russel Wallace. How many of you have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace? Yes, okay. Well, so if you look at your biology textbooks, they'll always say that the person who came up with evolution is Darwin and his contemporary Alfred Russel Wallace. The reason that I bring this up is because oftentimes they'll only talk about Darwin's viewpoint with regard to evolution. Darwin became an atheist after he discovered this concept of evolution, but they never tell you about the other man who discovered evolution, who's Alfred Russel Wallace. And the reason being, when Alfred Russel Wallace studied the evidence for evolution, he actually became a more dedicated believer. He actually became an individual who believed in God even more firmly. And that's because, of the concept of the soul. Alfred Russel Wallace, in his famous book, Natural Selection and Beyond, says, "Nothing in evolution can account for the soul of man. The difference between man and the other animals is unbridgeable. Mathematics is alone sufficient to prove in man the possession of a faculty unexistent in other creatures. No, the soul was a separate creation." Notice this is the father of modern day evolution saying that nothing in evolution can tell us about the concept of the soul. What does Allah tell us over 1400 years ago? وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the soul, but what you've been given of the soul is something very small, and from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So modern day evolution will never be able to come up with the reason for why we all have souls. The soul is something that cannot be proven or disproven scientifically, but it exists, and it's something that exists outside of the realm of evolution. And then the second concept is language. So when we come to the question, what does Islam say about evolution? Well, Islam says about evolution what it would say about other concepts in the world. Islam says, think and reflect and review the evidence. وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. There are certain aspects of evolution that are compatible with our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the prophets, and there are certain aspects of evolution which are incompatible. The things that are incompatible with Islam are the things for which the atheist evolutionary biologists themselves don't have evidence for. Meaning, they'll often say that evolution just created the soul randomly. But then you ask them, well, how did the soul just come up randomly? I mean, there is no other organism on earth that has the soul. They don't have any evidence, and they'll just sort of like be quiet. So the point being that evolution, like with everything else, we need to reflect on it and critically ask questions that enable us to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because ultimately, everything that Allah has created was created for a specific purpose. And evolution, rather than being something that takes us away from Allah, should be something that enables us to ask the questions that enable us to connect with Allah. And if you look at Islamic history, and if you look at the Quran and the various aspects of Quranic theology, you'll notice that for the most part, there's a tremendous deal of compatibility, but for everything else, we need to ask questions. So with that, I conclude, and we can maybe open it up for questions and answers if there's any.